Before we move on to create other unit tests, I would like to add a little more code to our testCreateUser method to have it a little bit more complete. And this is because when working with your unit tests and creating stub objects, it is good to have them as close to real objects as possible so that your unit tests cover a more realistic scenario and make sure that it works. And once you have that at least one unit test that tests for a successful scenario and it is as realistic as possible, you can continue adding other tests that can produce exceptions or errors and see if your code can handle those situations correctly. Also, it is a good practice and maybe a habit to make your unit tests cover as much as possible functionality that you have created in your service layer class, for example, or in other classes like REST controller or even utility classes. Unit tests versus integration tests, they're quick to run and they will not slow down your build process very much, but keep an eye on it not to create duplicate tests, for example, and not to test classes that you have already tested. Otherwise, you will complicate the whole thing and will do unnecessary work. So a good balance is needed. Try to cover with unit tests at least 80% of your code. So if we look at the address DTO object, for example, in our method, the object has many more fields, but we've set only one, which is type shipping. And instead of two addresses, we've created only one. In the examples of this project, we were testing HTTP requests with two addresses in the JSON payload, one for shipping, another for billing. And user DTO object also doesn't have most of the fields set, just the address. So let's look at the address DTO, for example. If I go to my project and then source and then response model, or request model, if I expand request and look at the address request, these are the fields that will be sent with a JSON payload to create a new user record with an address. So for that successful scenario in our unit test, we should try to set every single field in this object. So let's go back to our test and I will quickly add these fields to the address DTO. So we have type, city, country, postal code, and street name. Let me come here, city, country, street name. I think we are good. So I will save this and now I will create a new object, assuming that the billing address details are just same as shipping address details. I'll just change the object name, so that will be for billing address DTO. Now we'll replace this and we'll replace this billing. And now to my list of addresses, I will also add a billing address DTO. So now when I have added second address, when the createUser method is called, let's go to its implementation, this for loop will execute 2 times instead of 1 time, which is good because maybe inside of that for loop we had some business logic that would break if we had a second address. So let's go back, we have addresses complete. Let's set a user DTO. And again, it's good to look at the request model. So user details request model contains following field: password, email, first name, and last name. And it also has addresses. We do have addresses set, so we need to set these fields. Now let me do that. I'll go to user service test, and here I will add more fields. Okay, so I have addresses, I have first name, last name, password, which at this moment is not encrypted, and I have email address. And then I call createUser. So now when the user is created, I should expect back the first name, last name, and email address to be the same. And for example, if at least one of these fields are missing, then I know my code is not working properly. I should also expect exactly 2 addresses. And if my stored user details contains one address, or it contains both addresses that are shipping, for example, and there is no billing address, then I know that my code is not working. So these conditions we can test here. For example, we've tested for the first name, we can also assert that the last name is equal. So we can assert that after the object went through the user service implementation createUser method, this is our method under the test. once these details went through this method and they have been stored in a database, the user entity will contain a last name which is equal to the last name that is returned. And we actually have user entity object as well, which is a stub, and here the details of that object: first name, I don't have last name, password will be encrypted, set email verification token, and it will also be good to include 2 addresses into our entity object, because when our code runs and get list of addresses is called on the entity object, it should return 2 addresses that have been stored in a database. So let's go down here. Inside of our create user method, if we go in, there are a couple of values that we generate. We generate an address ID for each address, and we generate public user ID. So when create user method returns value, the stored user details must contain those 2 fields. So we can also assert not now that the stored user details does contain a public user ID, because this is a required field to return. So we'll get user ID. You get the idea. So, and for the addresses, if we need to compare addresses, what we can do, we can take this whole thing, the addresses, and put it into a separate method, which can be private to this class. For example, private, and it needs to return list of address DTO, and we will call it get addresses DTO, and add this code here like this. So the return value will be a list of addresses like this. Let's format this code. And we will need a similar method, which is also private, but this method will return list of addresses, but that will be address entity. So if I go to my entity package, it has address entity, list of address entity, and we will call it get addresses entity, something like this, and we'll add a body of this method. So now what this method will do, it will call the get addresses DTO to get list of addresses, but it will return back list of address entities. Oops, I did not copy it correctly, like this. And now we will use the model mapper to map the list of address DTO to the list of addresses entity, and then return the result of this mapping. So let me import address entity, let me import the token type, and now I will import the type and also the model mapper. Okay, so now when this method is called, it will first get list of addresses that we have created in DTO, and then it will get us the list of addresses, convert it into a list of addresses, but that will be list of address entities. And having this private method just helps us not to code these 2 addresses twice. So now let's scroll up to our entity. And here, when we create entities tab, we will use user entity to set addresses, but we will get this list of addresses from our private function. Okay, so now we can scroll down here, and inside of our method, the testCreateUser, we can compare that a list of addresses inside of user entity object is equal to list of addresses inside of user DTO object. That was returned after the create user method is called. So what I will do, I will use assert equals again, and I will take stored user details, get addresses, I will take its size, and I will do same on the user entity. Take user entity, get addresses, size, like this. And we have an underlining here for the addresses, and we have taken this code to a private function, so we will need to call it get addresses DTO, here it is, and remove this space. Okay, so let's try running this code and see if it works. And here we go, we have test passing, all three of them, and that means that our conditions here are all true. What we can also do, if I go to create user implementation, when we go through the list of addresses, we call the generate address ID on the utility class, and because we have two addresses, this method needs to be called twice. And we have, for example, the encode method on bcryptPassword encoder. We encode the user's plain text password and make it secure to keep it in database by encoding it. So we need to make sure that the encode method is also called. And there are ways to do this with Makita framework. And I will use Makita's verify method that takes in two parameters. First, it needs to have the mock object. And the second is the number of times the method on this mock object is called. So I will use times, for example, and for the generate address ID, we need it to be called twice because we are passing in a list of two addresses. And then we will put a dot, and we will need to provide the name of the method that we're going to call. And it doesn't auto-suggest us. Let's try importing Makita times. And let's import verify. And now let's try again. Here we go. So the generate address ID needs to be called twice. And now let's verify that the method on bcryptPassword encoder to encode the password is also called, but only one time. Like this. And that method is called encode, and it takes in a raw password. We have an example of our password here, so I'll copy this value here and paste it here. So now we're making sure that generate address ID method is called exactly two times, not three, not four, not one, because we're sending two addresses, and that the user's password is encoded, and that method is called one time only. So let's run our code and see if it works. And here we go, the bar is green and we have all assertions successfully passed. There are more things we can do with this unit test, and there are things to improve. For example, you can avoid hard coding 2 here. I know I have added 2 addresses, but a better solution will be, for example, to take number of addresses from actually the stored user details and take number of times from that list, like this. And there are other things that we can check. If we look at the user service implementation, if I scroll down to my method, we can make sure that the generate user ID is also called once. And finally, we have this save method, which must be called on user repository for this entire method to be successful, because otherwise, if save method is not called on user repository, then this entire method fails. And I will go to user service implementation test, and I will add a new line here because I want to verify that method save on user repository is called one time. I do not want it to be called twice or more than one time. This is why I need to specify that this method must be called once. And then I will choose method save. And this method save needs to take any user entity class. So I will copy this any user entity class and I will paste it here, and this is it. So I should be able to run this unit test, and hopefully the save method is called exactly one time, taking in any object which is of data type user entity. Now I need to run my unit test and hopefully it passes. Okay, so it worked. All 3 tests have passed and we are good to continue.